Friends, we welcome you to take your seats as we prepare to begin the Yom Kippur Symposium. Every year since 1975, the Yom Kippur Symposium has been an important and meaningful hour in the middle of our Yom Kippur day. Each of our speakers invited by me is asked to address the theme, How Judaism Has Shaped My Life. And each person I call and personally invite is initially very resistant, but ultimately they acquiesce. It is an honor, and we look forward to hearing each of their words. In this order, our speakers will deliver their messages. Dr. Mark Hanfling, Phyllis Cohen, Sandy Selzer Bryant, and William D. Ratnov, Dr. Bill Ratnov. These four are marvelous members of our congregation and soon to be even better friends of yours. And I'm grateful that they have accepted the invitation to share their words. For you in the room and for those of you on live stream, this is a special hour of meaning and significance.
Good afternoon. I don't know whether I should get a complex or not. This sort of reminds me of my first medical grand rounds that I gave on a Labor Day weekend, and the crowd was pretty sparse, and here we are on COVID Yom Kippur. But I'm Mark Hanfling, as Rabbi Lyon so noted, but in fact my given name is Marcus. I was named Marcus J. Hanfling after my beloved maternal grandfather, Jules Marcus, not Marcus Aurelius, or Marcus Welby, as many thought as I was growing up. When I think about growing up, I think about my comfort food. Everyone out there knows what that means, right? Well, I want to tell you about my journey to rediscover my comfort food. Some might say I am a Houstonian returnee, a northerner come back to roost in his hometown. My maternal grandmother, Carrie Stark, was from Houston, and in fact, she was one of the first confirmants here at Beth Israel, with her picture up on the Beth Israel gallery. Who would have thought? My mother was brought up in Cuba. Why? Because my maternal grandmother didn't care for being married to a dentist, and especially in New York City, where they met and initially lived. So my granny and grants moved from New York back to Houston, her roots. Shortly afterwards, my grandfather took the family to Cuba, where he started an import-export business. My mother was born in the USA, but lived in Cuba, except when she returned to Houston during any of the Cuban revolutions or upheavals. She actually made long-term friendships with family and others while she was visiting. But Cuba was her primary home and was probably a pretty diverse Jewish experience for her. My grandfather belonged and was active in a Cuban synagogue, unbeknownst to me until my mother, sister, and I returned for a last visit to Cuba many years ago. At that time, we discovered a document in the synagogue record showing his participation. Otherwise, it was a pretty non-Jewish environment in Cuba for my mother. My mother left Cuba, graduated from Stevens College in Missouri, and then met my dad, Seymour Hanfling, in New York City on a blind date. My dad, 10 years older, was a physician brought up by Eastern European immigrants with significant accents and old world values. They married and moved to a small town, South Orange, New Jersey, a wonderful Jewish environment. It was an interesting upbringing. It was kind of schizophrenic. On the one hand, we celebrated the major holidays, and I do mean major, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Passover. Since both my parents were only children, it was incredible quality time with our adopted Jewish community of aunts, uncles, and cousins. On the other hand, these same family and friends celebrated Easter, dyeing eggs and hiding them. My maternal great aunt would even bring us these big chocolate Easter bunnies. In addition, Christmas was really a big deal with the tree and stockings and all the trimmings. Based upon my mother's Cuban upbringing, this included tree trimming parties the week prior. I wish I could show you pictures of the proceedings and the tree. It was pretty incredible. And so were all the presents. Hanukkah, however, was fun and celebratory with the 8 days of candle lighting, songs, and prayers. But the gifts were relatively plebeian. Clothes, books, and other materials needed for school. I never could understand the dichotomy of types of presents. Even on Rosh Hashanah Day, if it coincided with the U.S. Tennis Open, we would rush out after the morning services and watch the tennis matches at Forest Hills, New York. But my two older sisters, Suki and Barbara, and I all went to Sunday school, confirmation, and me to Hebrew school to prepare for my bar mitzvah. I remember to this day my father not wanting me to wear a yarmulke or talit for my bar mitzvah. I don't think it was important to me, but obviously I remember. I was confirmed, but I didn't go to graduation in order to go to my sister's college graduation. This was the schizophrenic Jewish life I was exposed to and led. Why, you may say? Well, in part it was my mother's Cuban upbringing, but also she was incredibly social. Being an only child, as was my father, she was always seeking out an extended family and friends for herself and us. Holidays of any kind were an excuse for such get-togethers, and we took advantage of all of them. She didn't discriminate. My parents were wonderful Jewish role models, although not very religious. They were active in the synagogue and UJA, as it is called up north. My mother was president of the sisterhood at one point. Jewish ideals such as tzedakah, or giving, volunteering, and education were definitely important pillars of our upbringing. My sisters and I are all in the giving or service professions: psychiatric social worker, labor organizer and leader, and pediatrician. My mother was always trying to get my dad to directly influence my life trajectory. My dad, however, was not, I repeat, not a proselytizer. He was strictly a role model. Instead of trying to influence me directly, he showed me how much he enjoyed his life. Being a father, loving the game of tennis we all grew up playing, gardening even though I hated to weed, and caring for patients, not for money, but for the love and honor to do so. He showed me that money wasn't the most important thing. Spending quality of time with patients as a caring dermatologist was most important. My dad and I went to Israel together on a UJA father-son trip prior to going to college. I fell in love with Israel, but I've always been saddened by the fact that the three major religions find it difficult to coexist in, of all places, Jerusalem. I've been fortunate to return 2 more times to this beautiful land, the last of which was 3 years ago with Rabbis Lyon and Scott. As much as I love Israel, I'm still haunted by these thoughts of disharmony of the three religions. My father must have been quite a successful role model, parent, and teacher, because in many ways I'm his spitting image. However, at this point, I went through college and medical school without a real Jewish formal connection. I remember coming home from freshman year at Brown for the holidays, and it was my father who told my mother, "No more Christmas trees anymore. We're all grown up." After graduating from Northwestern, I came to Houston for my medical pediatric residency at Baylor College of Medicine. I was given a warm Texas welcome by my cousins, the Stearns and Friedlanders. Shortly thereafter, I met my first wife during my pediatric fellowship. She wasn't Jewish, and then after divorcing, I met my second wife, who was Jewish, but not practicing. She and her family did hold many of the basic Jewish precepts that I grew up with. But unfortunately, this too lasted less than 3 years. Don't get me wrong. Religion didn't play a major role, but it didn't help. Between going through intense medical training, then enduring the stress of running the pediatric emergency room at Ben Taub Hospital, having a family character flaw of being incredibly critical, and not having any my Jewish comfort food, my marriages had their challenges. Then I met the love of my life, Patty Barshop from San Antonio. We were fixed up by mutual friends, Carol Goldberg and Kathy Dreyfus, on a blind date, just like my parents were. I remind everyone that Patty's first blind date the night before ours with another man was so bad, it made me look really good in comparison the following evening. She was pretty, vivacious, fun, full of energy, as everybody knows, smart, and we talked and talked. She had 3 young children. Matthew, Hallie, and Josh. I fell in love with them all, and as I was to tell the kids later in life, they were not my biological children, but they were my chosen children. Patty's not overly religious, but she brought back my comfort food that I didn't even know I missed, literally and figuratively, our shared Jewish values and community. We dated long distance between San Antonio and Houston for a year, and then we were married. She and Matthew and Hallie and Josh moved to Houston. Who would have figured the girl from San Antonio knew more about Houston and the Jewish tribe than me, the boy who lived here and actually had family here? But she was incredibly connected. We joined Beth Israel because my grandmother had been and my relatives were members. We started our life together. We vowed to get past the 3-year mark I had failed to do twice before. We actually give thanks at least every 3 years to mark that milestone, and we'll have been together for 25 years this coming July 4th, which is our anniversary. We will always have fireworks celebrating our marriage because our kids wanted us to get married on the 4th for that very reason. Being a step-parent, I dislike that term, has been one of the most wonderful experiences and challenges of my life. I tried to be like my father, which goes hand in hand with how one's role should best be in a blended family. Not a disciplinarian, but a role model for our 3 children, hoping to show them the same things my father and mother showed me: love of life, love of learning, and moral everyday values. Patty has always had a strong sense of Judaism, and between her influence and the influence of my parents, I was looking for my out-of-work calling. My work is inherently volunteerism in my mind. I'm blessed to do it. I've worked for Baylor College of Medicine, but in particular Ben Taub Hospital and the Harris County Hospital District, now known as the Harris Health System, for over 40 years. I've devoted myself to the underserved and less fortunate as a clinician, academician, researcher, administrator, and advocate. Patty's been highly involved in the Jewish Family Services, Jewish Community Center, and Maccabi. And in fact, it was her chairing the Maccabi Housing Committee that prompted me to volunteer for what became an 8-year stint as a volunteer tennis coach for Maccabi. I sweated under the sweltering sun with my Mary Poppins umbrella to protect me from the sun for the 8 summers. This was well after our children aged out. It was incredibly challenging, but wonderfully satisfying. I was fortunate to have my mother return to Houston in her last declining years. She had an undiagnosable and untreatable peripheral neuropathy that eventually made her incredibly active mind captive to an unresponsive body. Coming to Houston took her away from her Jersey roots and social milieu, which was extremely, extremely hard. But she returned here to her Houston roots, Patty and me. We were blessed to be with her care for her, and share with her firsthand our lives, family, and Jewish manna. For those few years, but fortunate years. Blessed, even at the very end, when I got to hold her hand, give her permission to leave this world, and say goodbye. Afterwards, it was Rabbi Scott who helped me get a slightly better understanding of death and how to deal with my mother's and mine to be. To this day, I'm not sure where God plays a role in my life. Over the years, Patty and I have broken the tradition of my parents and have actually gone to Friday night services more and more, even taking advantage of Zoom services during this pandemic. Don't get me wrong, not regularly, but enough to know that every time we go, we both say to each other how much we are comforted by doing so. We become at peace with the world and with each other. Certain songs like the Mishaberach, Prayer for Healing, bring tears to my eyes almost every time I hear them. My comfort food is all about Jewish roots. It's not the same journey or destination for everyone, but has worked for me. It puts me in a place that has allowed me to be happy, comfortable, and always grow, and to be a role model as a husband, parent, brother, son, and educator. Good Yontiv and Happy New Year.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. I think so. Good afternoon. I want to first thank Rabbi Lyon for giving me the honor of speaking here today. I was asked to speak about how Judaism has affected my life. Although raised in an observant, conservative household, I have never been traditionally observant. I had an experience this past year, however, that has made me more connected to Judaism and has made me appreciate that my Jewish heritage is more central to my life than I had realized. Before the pandemic, my husband and I were scheduled to go on the Temple's Israel trip. Growing up, I was aware that I had relatives in both Israel and South Africa, but honestly, as a kid, I didn't pay much attention to who they were. Knowing that I was to be in Israel, however, I decided to try to see a first cousin who lives there and these other Israeli relatives that I had heard about. But I had to find these other relatives first. Luckily, I was not starting from scratch. Many years before, my mother had created a family genealogy. Although I never studied it, I had kept and safeguarded it for over 40 years. Honestly, I don't know how she did it. She did it before the internet and Ancestry.com, but she did it. This genealogy revealed the Jewish diaspora. In 1905, my mother's father and his brother came from Lithuania to the United States to escape persecution, and a sister went to South Africa for the same reason. 2 other siblings stayed in Lithuania. Their brother and his family were killed in the Holocaust, as were his sister Hannah, her husband, and 1 son. But Hannah's second son, Herzl Shapira, had managed to get to Denmark shortly before the war. He was the lone survivor of those members of my grandfather's family who had chosen to remain in Europe. Herzl ultimately emigrated to Israel and had 2 children there. And it was Herzl's children, my second cousins, that I was hoping to find. I looked further in the genealogy book. I found a picture from 1968 of Herzl, his wife, and my parents in Israel. I recalled my mother being so excited about going to see a relative in Israel, but as was typical of me then, I paid no attention. But when I looked at that picture in the genealogy book, I had an epiphany. What I did not realize at the age of 14 was that my mother was going to see her first cousin, her father's sister's son, a son who might have been killed like his mother, like his father, like his brother, like his aunt, uncle, and cousins, but who instead was saved. I can only imagine what it must have been like for these first cousins, Herzl and my mother, at this improbable, miraculous reunion. Just a short 20 years after the war through which both had lived, the rawness of the Holocaust was surely mixed with an emotional splendor of reunion. Seeing this picture and thinking about my mother's experience gave me a more personal understanding of the Holocaust and the experience of those who survived it. I felt connected to my heritage in a very palpable and tangible way. But I still wanted to find Herzl's children. That was the original goal. Their names were in the genealogy book, but I had no idea where in Israel they lived. I called my first cousin who had made Aliyah and lives in Tel Aviv. Herzl's children are her second cousins too, so I figured she would know where they were. A bit of Jewish geography. Israel's a small country, right? No such luck. She did not know where they were. I turned to LinkedIn, to Facebook, to white pages sites, to Jewish genealogy sites. I had more information about Herzl's son, Akikam Shapira, and his wife, Rina. So I looked hardest for them. I couldn't find anything. I was about to give up, but somehow, and I can't really retrace my steps now, I found a Rina Shapira in Los Angeles, and she had a Facebook site for an art business. I thought it was unlikely, but what the heck. I sent a private message on Facebook to her reporting that I thought her husband might be my second cousin, with a bit more detail so she did not think I was a total crank. And then I waited. I checked every day. A day went by, and then another, and then another. I was discouraged. Frankly, by the end of a week, I was despondent. And then a miracle. Rina, who checks her Facebook site but once a year, had checked her Facebook. My suspicion was true. Her husband was my second cousin, Herzl's son. They had emigrated to the US and now live in LA. I felt a little bit like my mother might have felt. Here I was on the verge of being connected to my blood relative, and neither of us might have been alive simply because our ancestors were Jews. Akikam called me the next day. He was thrilled, and we made plans to meet that summer, a plan we joyfully realized this summer after being postponed due to COVID. So now I had fulfilled my original quest. But could I do more? I had more second cousins. My grandfather's sister, who had emigrated to South Africa, had 7 children, and surely some of those 7 children had children. They are my and Akikam's second cousins also. Well, as it turns out, Akikam had been in touch with one of those cousins now living in Ottawa, Canada. Like me, and probably because of our ages, Akikam and he had been searching for greater connection with their roots. It was about this time that the pandemic hit in full. We have all experienced great disconnection from family, friends, and places. But the pause in my normal activities gave me the time and space to discover a connection that I never expected. I decided to try to connect with as many of the second cousins, the second-generation descendants of these siblings from Lithuania, as I could. Akikam had the email address of one cousin, of the Ottawa cousin. I contacted him. He gave me the addresses of some of his cousins and siblings in South Africa. I had lost touch with one of my first cousins, but one of my other cousins had his address. After at least 40 years, he was overjoyed to reconnect. I ended up communicating with about 20 of my relatives, ages 68 to 88, and let me be on record to say that I am the youngest. Second-generation descendants of the siblings from Lithuania. I created a master email list and connected everyone together. Many of us, most of us had never met, and for many who had met, even first cousins, many had lost contact. We were emblematic of the next generation of the Jewish diaspora. We hailed from Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, Oregon, Houston, Ottawa, Florida, New York, London, Johannesburg, Cape Town, and Tel Aviv. While our ancestors were persecuted, their families persevered, and their descendants prospered around the world. The capstone of my cousin project, as I came to call it, was a Zoom call with all of us. In this year of disconnection, Zoom connected us. Somehow, we found a time that we all could meet, and this year we all met on Zoom across 8 time zones. Several of us included our own children, the great-grandchildren of the Lithuanian siblings. We talked for 2 hours, and we could have talked more. I was thrilled, and I know everyone else was as well. In the many hours I had to do little but think during the pandemic, I thought about why. Why were we all so thrilled to be connected? Why did I talk about my cousin project all the time? You know, many people lose contact and are happy to be reunited. But the special thrill for us, I think, emanated directly from the fact that we are Jewish. Our ancestors had been forced to move or perish as their siblings and parents did. The potential that we would not have been here, much less have reconnected, made our reunion that much sweeter and more grounded in our shared Jewish heritage. And then I continued to think, what else about me is true because I am Jewish? I'd never really posed that question before. I wondered, is it because I am Jewish that I care about some of the things on which I focus? Even though I do not consider myself observant, has the heritage passed down to me from Lithuania made me observant in Jewish values, if not in rituals? And so, I think the answer is yes. I realize that many of the things I do, and certainly many things to which I aspire, are founded in Judaism. For example, I focus on voting rights. Is that a Jewish value? Rabbi Yitzhak taught in the Talmud that a ruler is not to be appointed unless the community is first consulted. There can be no more straightforward instruction than that. I am focused on equity in healthcare. The scholar Maimonides placed healthcare first on his list of the 10 communal services a community should offer. Again, Judaism is direct about this value. Many of the issues to which I devote my energies can be summarized in the familiar words of Deuteronomy: justice, justice shall you pursue. I don't pretend to live perfectly every Jewish value, but what I think this year of the Cousin Project and my resulting greater connection to my Jewish heritage has shown me is that while I never felt I was an observant Jew, I, in fact, have been observant to Jewish values. In turn, this recognition has made me feel more Jewish, more connected to my heritage, and to the principles of equity, tolerance, and justice foundational to the Jewish faith. I look forward to exploring in the years to come how Jewish values are alive in me, and more importantly, how I can make those values more alive in our society. I cannot be thankful for the pandemic, but I am thankful for the time it gave me to find this new dimension to my life. Thank you all for spending this time with me today. I wish each of you a healthy, peaceful, and meaningful new year.
Several months ago, I received an email from Rabbi Lyon with the opportunity to be one of this year's symposium speakers, terror-struck. I'm not a speaker. I'm an artist. I offered to do a painting. This suggestion did not go well. So I said to Rabbi Lyon, "We need to talk." We did, and here I am. A few things I'm certain about my Judaism. I am 99.6% Ashkenazi. I enjoy the traditions, rituals, and the food. A few things I'm certain about myself. I strongly value connection. Connection with others to my art and to my Judaism. My Judaism has a profound link to my making art. My art is created layer upon layer, while Judaism's foundation is built on layers of histories. Both celebrate life and are open to interpretation. Perhaps most salient, my art and my Judaism also reflect the value I place on relationships, connecting people to people and people to art. I was born and raised in Pittsburgh and was so very fortunate to grow up in an environment of strong connection to a family large in size, personality, and devotion to religious traditions. Our family was a member of Rodef Sholem congregation, a classically reformed temple founded in 1906 and magnificently designed of the style of Beaux-Arts architecture. I always imagined I would be married in its striking sanctuary. I met my husband, John, at Carnegie Mellon University. I was getting a BFA in painting, John a PhD in economics. I like to say we complement each other. However, according to my family tradition, a Jew marrying a Christian was not complementary. My father, with tears in his eyes, implored us to raise our children to be Jewish. Unfortunately, as John was Christian, my dream of walking down that long aisle to be married at Rodef Sholem was not going to happen. A few days later, John told me he wanted to convert, not just for me, but due to a connection he had developed with Judaism while spending time with my family. Not knowing how this might play out for us as a couple, I was conflicted. However, I was certain I would never give up my Judaism, and he was persistent in his desire to convert. On June 24th, 1973, we were married, and I did walk down that long aisle at Rodef Sholem as I had envisioned. Our 47 years together had us living in many cities, first moving from Pittsburgh to DC, then Minneapolis, Gainesville, Houston, Palo Alto, and Tilburg, the Netherlands. Our very first experience of independently affiliating with a congregation came when I was pregnant in Minneapolis. Our goal was to be members before the high holidays, and our baby would be born. Crossing the Mississippi, we joined our first temple in St. Paul as a family of 2, soon to be 3. Though I likely did not realize it at the time, connection to a Jewish community immediately became a consummate priority for us as we continued to move through life's adventures. In 1981, it was time for a weather change. John accepted a chaired position in the economics department at Rice University. I can make art anywhere. Without really thinking about it, I told our realtor we wanted to live in a Jewish neighborhood near a Reformed temple. Beth Israel warmly welcomed us. We attended Friday night services because what could be better than being blessed by Rabbi Karf at the end of the week? And soon we formed a close core of friends. Traditions took roots. Our friend group became our Houston family, taking turns hosting the different occasions. Tables were full of multi-generational relatives and friends. Through the years, my bond to the community continued to grow. I was active in the temple, had a stint on the sisterhood board, chaired a few events, and made my share of brownies. Being an abstract painter and needing to use a ruler to cut hundreds and hundreds of brownies evenly was a challenge. Our daughter Erin attended religious school, was a bat mitzvah, and confirmed. At Green Family Camp, Erin learned every prayer and tune by heart. I really enjoyed sitting next to her at services and was proud to watch her establish her own connections. When I chaired the Israeli Art Fair, I became very close with a young couple, Adrian and David Scott. I wonder whatever happened to them. Over the years, Rabbi Adrian Scott and I have continued our relationship through sharing and caring a connection that continues to prove invaluable to me. In the spring of 2012, more than a decade after my daddy passed away, my mother moved into our home. This was not the plan. I turned to Adrian to advise me about this adjustment in our lives. I needed words of wisdom, patience, and insight. My mom flourished, forming deep connections of her own at the JCC in Temple. Her social calendar was packed, and she was even on the cover of one of the United Way's publications. She was elated to be Jewish Houston famous. At that time, I was blissfully unaware of the crucial role that my relationship to Judaism was to play in the next phase of my life. John had been powering through physical and mental challenges for too many years. In December 2015, we finally received a definitive diagnosis: a few types of Parkinson's disease with the added complication of Lewy body dementia. That long-awaited diagnosis explained so much. PD is a movement disorder. Adding Lewy body made it immeasurably worse. Both are degenerative. There are no cures, no getting better. John was 68, and we had lots of plans for getting old together. After the diagnosis, we decided to be forthcoming about his health with our family and friends. Our new normal began. Our objective: to continue to have a full life together, with limitations, of course. However, soon it was clear John's body and mind were declining faster than we had hoped. Lots of falls, stitches, ambulance rides, and hospital stays. I think some of my friends were afraid to pick up the phone when they saw my number. Especially disappointing was that John never returned to Rice to teaching and research that was so vital to him. After 35 years at Rice University, he was forced into retirement with no warning. Every day, John would say to me, "It's okay, babe. We will get through this. We can do this together." But could I do this? I was exhausted, sleep-deprived, frustrated, angry, and scared. Everything was happening so fast. How was I going to make good decisions for John's care? We always made big decisions together. Once again, I reached out to Adrian. She continued to play a balanced, objective, and soothing role in my life, especially when I was forced to make the toughest of decisions. Way sooner than I imagined, our house was no longer a safe place for John to live. He could not receive the care he needed. I was beyond devastated. Move him out of our home? How could I do this to John? How could I do this to us? In that moment, I realized that my charge was to find John, my partner in life, the best place for him to live safely. There are no words to describe what I was feeling the day I moved John into Silverado Memory Care Community. It was August 18th, 2018, and John no longer lived in our home. This is where the village came in. In addition to keeping John safe, it was my mission for his life to be as full as possible and for as long as possible. Keeping our friends in our lives became priority. For the most part, people showed up. Our core friends were gracious, grabbing John's favorite takeout and spending evenings in the dining room at the facility, and joining us for holiday celebrations at Silverado. It took a lot for John to muster up the energy for these visits, but they were so appreciated and necessary. John never gave up. He always had a smile and a genuine, intense gratitude for his relationships. Maintaining meaning also took the form of doing my best to integrate Judaism into our lives at the community. This manifested in the amazing staff putting Hanukkah decorations up at my request, humoring me when I presented the cook with traditional Jewish recipes and offering to hold Shabbat services. During this time, John's relationship to his son-in-law, Sean, grew into one of the most treasured relationships. We always knew Sean was great. He put up with our daughter, Erin, after all, with a smile. But I never could have anticipated the role he would play in this phase of our lives. John and Sean became the dynamic duo. They would spend time together almost daily, Sean never empty-handed arriving, always with a milkshake, endless patience, and a serene demeanor. Though Catholic, Sean proved over and over that he is a true mensch. The hospice care team meeting was March 11, 2020. It was clear John's condition was worrisome. I had a quick visit with John and said I would be back. A few hours later came the call. Silverado was shutting down for COVID. No visitors. I made it clear that John was not to die alone. Almost 3 weeks later, John was transitioning. Another bit of knowledge I never wanted to have was the actively dying process. Erin, Sean, and I were allowed to be with him. We were so fortunate. Because during that time, most families were not granted such grace. 48 hours later, John passed. All three of us were with him. John did not die alone. Even though I knew this was coming, I was not ready. Call to Adrian. This was COVID times. We could not do John's funeral as pre-planned. Now what? John was the first Jewish funeral since COVID began. The traditions that had been there to guide me were profoundly absent. Only 10 people at the cemetery. We had to bring our own chairs, masks, gloves, and shovels to sprinkle the earth onto the coffin. No standing together. The service was brief. No shivas or minions planned. I was lost and felt alone. How were our friends and family going to express condolences and honor John's memory? The next few months, I constantly thought about John's memorial service. As the one-year anniversary was approaching, it was still not safe for all to gather. Called to Adrian, who came up with a plan, have a small unveiling at the cemetery, followed with a Zoom memorial service. April 25th, 2021, with friends and family from all over, John was celebrated. There were prayers and songs and images and laughter. John is always with me. I will miss John forever and forever. Sorry. I loved deeply and was loved deeply in return. What a blessing. What grief has done to me is put me right in the middle of a fire that burns away all that is not essential in my life as I move forward. Judaism has taught me to help others. I plan to always share all that I learned with those in need. Thank you to my very wise Rabbi David Lyon, who challenged me during my most vulnerable time to explore how Judaism guides me, and to Rabbi Adrian Scott for helping me maintain a Jewish perspective as I dealt with many of life's challenges. And to my loving daughter, Erin, and my dear friend, Jeff Tucker, for their assisting me with my preparation for today, and to our community who continues to support me. A good wish for the new year and a hope for my family as we continue without John, but always with his memories. May we all go from strength to strength, and may our connections flourish as we endure life's challenges and share in life's blessings. Lashana Tova.
That was a piece of ours.
Thank you, Rabbi Lyon, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I'm very honored. Lashana Tova Tika Sevu to you all. I'm Bill Ratnov. My family and I have been members at Beth Israel for about 13 years. My assignment today was to talk about what Judaism means to me or how it has shaped my life. I can enlarge upon the Jewish principles that were the foundation of my life and upbringing, but I think my personal reminiscences may be more interesting. My mother died at home last September 2020, just before Rosh Hashanah. Today, we wonder if we will be inscribed in the book of life and think about our deeds over the past year that have left their mark. On this Yom Kippur, among other things, I'm reflecting on the way I have tried to honor my mother's memory, how well I honored her wishes and followed her instructions, and how I have measured up as Marion's son. Let me tell you, my mother had a lot of instructions. For example, she expected frequent and regular phone calls. You knew you were on Mother's good list when she gave you a scheduled time of day to call you. Mine was just before dinner, her dinner, around 5 p.m. Eastern. Once when I called earlier in the day, she promptly requested that I call back at my allotted time. She expected you to be well-informed and well-read. She would mail you newspaper clippings and recently published books that she thought you ought to have already read. Did you read thus and such an article in the New Yorker? Or, what did you think of the new biography of Scott Fitzgerald? I just want you to be happy, spoken in tones of regret, was her way of letting you know that she disapproved. Included in her instructions was guidance from earlier generations, including my two grandmothers. Be good and kind and do your work. Spoken at partings by her mother-in-law, my Grandma Ethel. Don't cook yourself. Spoken by her mother, my Nana, which meant don't get agitated about something unimportant. These instructions have stuck with me and come in handy in many situations, including attending Talmud classes here at Beth Israel. I grew up in Shaker Heights, Ohio. My sister Martha and I walked the 3 blocks to Fernway Elementary School, where my mother had taught and was still an occasional substitute teacher. We students pledged to be courteous at all times, both at work and at play, and to respect our parents and teachers, and, most importantly, the property rights of others. Many of my schoolmates were Jewish, most were not. At some point between ages 4 and 6, I came to the realization that I was Jewish. Mother grew up with Jewish traditions, which she tried to pass on to my sister and me. My father observed his bar mitzvah, but did not want to participate in organized religion, despite his deep interests in Jewish history, culture, and welfare in Israel. For this reason, until confronted by my sister and me, our family did not join a congregation. When I was 8 and Martha 7, we insisted on enrolling in religious school like our classmates. and thus began my formal Jewish education. My first rabbi was Abba Hillel Selzer, a staunch Zionist who was the person who spoke at the United Nations in May 1947 to formally propose the establishment of the State of Israel. Rabbi Selzer shaped my views of social justice as central to Judaism and taught me to value life above all else, as we heard in today's Torah portion from Deuteronomy. Our education emphasized our ancient history of resistance to oppression and persecution and the crucial importance of ethical behavior. My religious school, especially in the early 60s, was very concerned with progress and modernity. We learned how to pronounce the Hebrew from an Israeli teacher, which was pretty radical at the time now that I think about it. My mother, who grew up in Baltimore, still spoke Hebrew with the older pronunciation. Think of any of your relatives from Brooklyn. Adonai instead of Adonai. Shabbos instead of Shabbat. Mother and Dad would quote pithy Yiddish sayings, but didn't want my sister or me to repeat them. Oi, gewalta ve'esmir. A mother who loved to provide instruction was certainly made to embrace Passover, and indeed each Jewish holiday had a menu and home observance apart from synagogue observances. Mother particularly liked to create a party with lots of people and great, if sometimes controversial, conversation and the recitation of poetic passages. Our Passovers were guided by the Haggadah for the American family and the judicious interpretation of rules by mother and assembled participants. Mother and Dad emphasized the connection between the story of the Exodus and the struggle for social justice, freedom, civil rights, and civil liberties in our own lives. Each family member had his or her favorite passage. For Papa, my maternal grandfather, it was the passage that begins, "Lo, this is the bread of affliction, the humble and simple bread which our ancestors ate." For my father, it was the psalm that says, "The mountains skipped like rams, the hills like young sheep. What aileth thee, O thou sea, that thou fleest, thou Jordan, that thou turnest backward?" For me, it was, "And thou shalt tell thy child in that day, saying, It is because of that which the Eternal did for me when I came forth out of Egypt." We're still using the same Haggadah, and my sister's family likewise. The original copies gradually disintegrated and disappeared, and we're down to photocopies which have accumulated their own wine and Herosis stains. And incidentally, also preserve the advertisement for the fabled four. In this context, meaning Chase and Sanborn coffee, Chase and Sanborn instant coffee, Tenderleaf tea, and Planters oil. Our adult children have decided it's time to update the Haggadah. They plan to use Adobe Acrobat to superimpose gender-neutral language and other phrases onto our dog-eared but scanned pages to bring it in line with our modern use of inclusivity, and so that we don't have to ad-lib synonyms for God in every paragraph. In religious school, despite an era of children being seen and not heard, we were encouraged to experience Jewish life firsthand. One of my memories was being advised to attend and experience a Jewish funeral before one of our own family members died. For our education. Decidedly ghoulish advice to hear at the age of a junior high student, but I did get the point to learn what to expect. Religious school also set the stage for deeper learning in Jewish texts. Apart from midrashes and sermons, one of my earliest encounters with the Talmud came from my father, a hematologist who had read about Talmudic rulings regarding hemophilia and circumcision. His interest in the Talmud led me to jump at the chance to join David Scott's Talmud study here during the early Zoom days of the pandemic. Aside from the content of the Talmud, I was struck by its structure, how it juxtaposes opposing arguments, and the fundamental roles of questioning, discussion, debate, and occasionally a conclusion. The Talmud induces the reader to really think about and to judge the validity of prescriptive assertions about Jewish practice. This method came in handy when I found myself confronted by my mother's non-negotiable burial wishes. This much I knew. My mother wanted to be near my father, Oscar. In the last decade of her life, she often sat on a rusty bench that she had asked the cemetery to place nearby under a towering oak tree. She would sit there and talk to Osk, contemplating him in his final resting place, and her own. At the time of Dad's death, we discovered there wasn't an adjacent burial plot, but the grave had room for a so-called second opening. In other words, the grave had room for a vault to house cremated remains. Had my mother known this from the very beginning? Was this part of her desire to be close, really close, to my father for all eternity? Cremation was not something my sister and I did not want to do. For one thing, we had never done this in our family. Mother, however, had said to me on many occasions that the deceased body was not identical with the person, and would say with characteristic wit, "When I'm dead, I'm gone." Mother wished to be cremated and demanded that I promise to fulfill her wish. She put me in an impossible situation. I certainly wasn't going to be happy carrying out these plans, but I followed her detailed and ironclad instruction. I did not want to disappoint her even after her death. The rest of it I had to guess at. My wife Donna and I zigzagged across the country in our car to make it to Ohio without falling ill. We live streamed from the graveside for the grandchildren locked down in their respective cities. Even the memorial stone required months of back and forth discussion until finally the wording felt right. Marion Foreman Ratnov, wife, mother, Nana, teacher, lawyer, writer, a loved and loving woman. Those who knew her and her love of a good party might presume that Mother died of boredom from lack of stimulating personal interactions during the COVID pandemic in the months before her death. We said our goodbyes via FaceTime. I recited Psalm 23, one of her favorites. I recited the words of the Shema while Mother listened. Her attendants alerted me that she had ceased breathing while I was still speaking to her. I don't know if it brought her comfort, but it was comforting to me in such a bewildering, disconcerting situation. My mother's death changed a lot. This year of mourning has taken a path as long and winding as the drive from Houston to Cleveland, Ohio. We miss her, and I feel sad about her not being here, but I've thought of her death as the end of an era that her life represented. Something about losing a parent makes you think about the future, about what will become of our intergenerational Jewish traditions. After we unveiled the memorial stone and said our prayers, we all retired to the COVID-safe backyard of the Cleveland-based Cousins. My mother's instructions were resounding in my sister's mind as she handed out hand sanitizer and wipes. Had everyone complied with the family's post-funeral rituals of washing our hands immediately upon returning home from the cemetery, and then drinking orange juice. At this point, there was no debate or deliberation. We all knew what to do. An intergenerational through line stretched from my grandmothers to my mother, to me and my sister and my wife, to our children and beyond. L'odor vador, from generation to generation. It has been and continues to be the cornerstone of our people and the hope we share for the new year. May you all be inscribed in the book of life, an easy fast and good Yontif.
Friends, thank you for being such a wonderful audience and recipient of such insight and wisdom. Another round of applause for our speakers. Our afternoon service and other programs, including Alternative Insights and the Alternative Service, will begin in about 5 minutes.